October 1943, 20,000 feet above Germany. The sky was filled with flak. Black bursts opened in tight clusters around the formation, each one a calculated explosion timed by radar and range-finding crews on the ground. The B-17 Flying Fortress shook violently as shrapnel tore through its aluminum skin. Inside the aircraft, oxygen masks hissed. The air was thin and bitterly cold, nearly 40 degrees below zero. The men inside the bomber were not thinking about glory. They were thinking about survival. The B-17 had been flying over hostile territory for nearly 3 hours. Below lay factories, rail yards, oil facilities, the industrial skeleton of the Reich. Around it flew dozens of identical bombers in tight formation, each separated by only a few dozen yards. The concept was simple: strength in numbers. But at that altitude, numbers did not stop flak. The first burst struck close. The aircraft jolted hard to the left, metal screamed, fragments ripped through the right wing. One engine sputtered, then continued running, rough but alive. The tail gunner reported holes in the stabilizer. The top turret gunner shouted something about hydraulic pressure. A radio crackled with overlapping voices from nearby aircraft, and still, the formation held. The B-17 had earned its name, Flying Fortress, not because it was invulnerable, but because it had been designed with defense in mind. Unlike earlier bombers that relied primarily on speed or altitude, the B-17 carried multiple .50 caliber machine guns, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Nose guns, top turret, ball turret beneath the belly, waist guns, tail guns. From almost every angle, a fighter approaching the formation would face converging fire. But flak was different. Flak did not aim for individual aircraft. It aimed for space, calculated where the formation would be, and detonated shells within that volume. The explosions sent razor-sharp fragments in all directions. One fragment the size of a thumb could sever control cables. Another could puncture fuel lines. A larger piece could tear through crew compartments. The B-17's aluminum skin was thin, sometimes barely thicker than a few stacked coins. And yet, time and again, aircraft returned to England riddled with holes that should have ended them. The bomber in the October sky absorbed another burst. The No. 3 engine coughed violently. Oil sprayed across the wing. The pilot eased the throttle back to prevent total failure. If the engine seized, the propeller would create drag that could pull the aircraft out of formation, and isolation meant vulnerability to fighters. Below and behind the formation, German interceptors climbed. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s had learned how to attack heavy bombers efficiently. Head-on passes exploited the B-17's limited frontal firepower in earlier variants. Coordinated attacks from multiple angles attempted to overwhelm defensive guns. But attacking a formation was dangerous. A single B-17 might be vulnerable. A tight group of them was something else entirely. The doctrine behind the bomber was based on a controversial belief that heavily armed daylight bombers could defend themselves without continuous escort. It was a belief tested brutally in 1943. During missions deeper into Germany, especially when escort fighters lacked sufficient range, B-17 formations suffered severe losses. Aircraft were torn apart. Crews bailed out over hostile territory. Entire groups returned to base missing dozens of planes. And yet, the bomber itself developed a reputation among crews for something remarkable. It endured. The B-17 structure was built around a strong internal framework, spars and longerons that carried load through the fuselage and wings. Control systems were often routed with redundancy in mind. Fuel tanks, though vulnerable, were self-sealing to reduce catastrophic ignition. It was not indestructible, but it was resilient. The aircraft over Germany that day took another hit. Shrapnel shattered the nose plexiglass. The bombardier ducked instinctively as fragments sliced through maps and instruments. The navigator checked the compass, still functioning. The pilot kept formation. To leave formation was to invite concentrated fighter attack, so they stayed. Reports from ground observers in England often told extraordinary stories: bombers landing with entire sections of tail missing, aircraft returning on two engines, wings perforated so heavily they resembled metal lace. Some of those stories were rare extremes. Many were simply evidence of engineering margins, of structure capable of absorbing localized damage without total failure. The B-17 was not surviving because it was immune. It was surviving because it had been designed to tolerate partial destruction. In combat, total destruction is rarely immediate. More often, it is progressive, systems failing one by one until lift, control, or power is lost. The Flying Fortress resisted that progression. As the formation approached the target, bombs were released in sequence. The aircraft lightened slightly. The pilot adjusted trim. Flak continued. One engine now ran at reduced power. Fuel leaked slowly from a punctured line, but not fast enough to ignite. The crew's survival depended on something simple: reaching friendly airspace before cumulative damage overwhelmed the machine. Thousands of B-17 crews would live or die by that margin. The aircraft was not invincible. It was stubborn, and in the skies over Germany in 1943, stubbornness could mean the difference between falling in flames and limping home across the Channel. The B-17 survived what should have killed it, not through myth, but through structure, redundancy, and the brutal mathematics of formation defense. But the sky was only part of the story. Because sometimes, what nearly killed it came not from flak, but from fighters closing fast at 400 miles per hour. By late 1943, German fighter pilots had learned a hard truth: attacking a B-17 formation from behind was dangerous. The tail gunner had a clear field of fire. Waist gunners could pivot. The top turret could rotate quickly. Multiple .50 caliber machine guns overlapped arcs. A fighter that lingered in the bomber's defensive cone risked being shredded. So the Luftwaffe adapted. The head-on attack became the preferred method. It was brutally simple. German fighters would climb above and ahead of the bomber stream, then roll inverted and dive directly toward the approaching formation. Closing speeds could exceed 600 miles per hour. In those final seconds, the fighter pilot aimed for the cockpit or the nose section, the most vulnerable part of the aircraft. The B-17's frontal defense in earlier variants was limited. A few flexible guns covered the nose, but nothing compared to the defensive density aft of the wings. In a head-on pass, everything happened in seconds. The German pilot fired first. 20mm cannon shells, sometimes 30mm in later aircraft, streaked forward. Unlike machine gun rounds, cannon shells carried explosive charges. A single direct hit in the cockpit could incapacitate pilots instantly. A strike to the nose could kill the bombardier and navigator in an instant. For the B-17 crew, the head-on attack was the most terrifying. You saw the fighter coming. There was no blind angle. No mystery, just a rapidly enlarging silhouette dead ahead. Inside the bomber, the nose gunner and bombardier fired continuously as the fighter approached. Tracers converged, but the geometry was unforgiving. The closing speed reduced engagement time to mere seconds. Impact often came before reaction. In some cases, cannon shells punched through the thin aluminum skin and detonated inside crew compartments. Plexiglass shattered, control panels splintered, blood mixed with freezing air. And yet, sometimes, the bomber continued flying. The B-17's survival under such attack came down to structure and redundancy. Unlike lighter aircraft, the Flying Fortress did not rely on a single structural member to hold its nose section together. The forward fuselage was reinforced by internal frames designed to distribute load. Even when sections were punctured or partially destroyed, the overall structural integrity could remain intact long enough to maintain lift. Pilots were often killed or wounded in these attacks. In several documented cases, co-pilots or even other crew members took control. The cockpit layout allowed for transfer of command quickly if necessary. Dual control columns meant either pilot could fly, assuming one survived. Hydraulic systems were vulnerable. But some control surfaces could still function mechanically if hydraulics failed. Control cables were sometimes duplicated or routed separately to reduce total loss from a single hit. Still, survival was never guaranteed. During the Schweinfurt missions, head-on fighter attacks caused catastrophic losses among unescorted formations. Entire sections of bombers were destroyed within minutes. The tactic was effective, but it was not without cost. German pilots flying head-on passes had to commit fully. There was no time for evasive maneuver until the final instant. Misjudgment of closure speed could result in collision. Defensive fire, though limited, could still be deadly. More importantly, the B-17 formations began adapting. Later variants introduced improved chin turrets beneath the nose, powered gun mounts that dramatically increased frontal firepower. The B-17G, equipped with this chin turret, significantly reduced vulnerability to direct frontal assault. Head-on attacks did not disappear, but they became riskier. The bomber's defensive doctrine relied on interlocking fire from multiple aircraft in tight formation. A German fighter approaching head-on did not face just one nose gun. He faced guns from adjacent aircraft as well. The combat box formation was designed precisely for this. Each bomber positioned so its guns could protect others. It was not perfect. It was costly, but it created a zone of overlapping fire that made repeated attack passes hazardous. Even when fighters broke through and inflicted heavy damage, the B-17 often refused to disintegrate instantly. There are documented cases of aircraft returning with entire nose sections shredded, instrument panels destroyed, pilots dead at the controls, engines burning but not yet failed. Why? Because lift is generated by wings, and unless the wing spar was catastrophically severed, the aircraft could often continue flying even with severe fuselage damage. Because 4 engines offered margin, losing one did not mean immediate descent. Losing 2 might still allow controlled flight if power was managed carefully. Because aluminum tears, but it does not shatter like wood or composite. The B-17's ability to endure partial destruction often bought crews time. Time to stabilize. Time to extinguish small fires. Time to redistribute fuel. Time to cross back into friendly airspace. But the head-on attack was only one method. As 1944 approached, German units experimented with heavier weapons, underwing rockets, 30mm cannon pods, designed to break bomber formations with fewer passes. Each escalation increased lethality. And yet, the flying fortress continued to return, scarred, punctured, leaking oil, sometimes missing entire sections of control surfaces. The reason was not magic. It was engineering margins, weight carried for strength, systems designed with backup in mind, and the simple arithmetic of 4 engines instead of 2. But the sky above Germany was not just flak and fighters. It was also isolation. Because when a B-17 fell out of formation, damaged, slowing, unable to maintain altitude, its greatest protection disappeared. And survival then depended on something else entirely. The B-17's greatest protection was not its armor, it was proximity. Inside the tight geometry of a combat box, every bomber supported the others. Defensive fire overlapped, fighters hesitated before committing to sustained attack. A damaged aircraft could remain shielded long enough to reach friendly skies. But when a fortress fell out of formation, the equation changed instantly. It usually began subtly. A damaged engine lost power. The aircraft began drifting slightly behind the group. The pilot pushed throttles forward on remaining engines, trying to maintain speed. If the bomber lagged too far, the formation would not slow for it. They could not. The structure of the formation depended on speed and altitude discipline. If one aircraft slowed significantly, it became isolated, and isolation was fatal. German fighter pilots understood this perfectly. They watched for stragglers. A lone B-17 trailing behind the formation was a wounded animal. It lacked overlapping defensive arcs from neighboring aircraft. It could be attacked from multiple angles in sequence without immediate crossfire. And yet, even alone, the flying fortress sometimes refused to die. A straggling B-17 often had already suffered damage. Perhaps one engine was out. Perhaps hydraulic systems were compromised. The crew might have wounded members. The aircraft might be slowly losing altitude. The pilot faced a brutal calculation: stay at high altitude where engines strained and oxygen remained essential, or descend, gaining denser air but exposing the bomber to light anti-aircraft fire from the ground. Meanwhile, fighters circled. German tactics against isolated bombers were methodical. Fighters attacked from blind spots, low 6 o'clock, high side angles, or from beneath the belly where the ball turret's coverage was limited by damaged hydraulics or frozen mechanisms. Cannon shells tore into exposed sections. The B-17's ball turret gunner, suspended beneath the fuselage in a cramped spherical housing, had one of the most dangerous roles. When operational, the turret offered excellent downward defense, but if power was lost or mechanisms jammed, the belly became vulnerable. Still, even isolated, the fortress had strengths. 4 engines meant options. If one engine was lost entirely, the remaining 3 could sustain level flight with careful throttle management. If 2 engines on one wing were lost, the aircraft might still limp home by reducing drag, feathering propellers, redistributing fuel to balance weight. Pilots learned to nurse crippled aircraft with extraordinary skill. Control cables, though vulnerable, were sometimes partially severed rather than completely destroyed. A pilot might find elevator response sluggish but not gone, rudder authority reduced but usable, ailerons stiff yet functional. The B-17 was not flying cleanly. It was fighting gravity. There are documented cases of aircraft returning with enormous sections of wing skin torn away, exposing internal spars and ribs, yet maintaining structural integrity because the primary load-bearing spar remained intact. To a ground observer, such an aircraft seemed impossible. To an engineer, it demonstrated design margin. Aluminum skin carried aerodynamic load but not the full structural burden. The internal spar system bore the majority of stress. As long as the spar was not severed, lift remained possible. Still, survival was never guaranteed. Many stragglers did not return, but enough did that the reputation of the B-17 solidified. Stories circulated of aircraft landing with tails partially missing, of bombers returning on 2 engines, of crews bailing out only after flying across hostile territory for hours in crippled machines. Some of these accounts became legendary. Others were simply daily reality in the air war over Europe. The fortress survived because it degraded gradually. Aircraft do not fail instantly unless a critical component is destroyed catastrophically. The B-17's distributed systems delayed that catastrophic threshold. Fuel tanks were self-sealing, reducing the risk of immediate fire. Hydraulic systems, though vulnerable, were not the sole means of control. Electrical systems were compartmentalized. Oxygen systems could sometimes function even after partial damage. Every additional minute in the air increased the chance of crossing into friendly territory. Crossing the English Channel often marked the true turning point. German fighters rarely pursued far beyond the coastline due to fuel constraints and defensive risks. Once over water, a damaged B-17 might still ditch, but rescue by Allied vessels or aircraft was possible. The crew inside a straggling bomber understood this geography intimately. They measured survival not in miles, but in minutes. 15 more minutes to the coast. 10 more minutes over water. 5 more minutes to an English airfield. Inside the aircraft, tasks became triage. Gunners continued scanning for fighters. The engineer monitored remaining engines. The navigator recalculated headings if instruments were damaged. The radio operator attempted to transmit position reports. Sometimes, wounded crew members were treated mid-flight. Sometimes, dead crew members remained strapped into their positions until landing. And sometimes, the aircraft held together through damage that seemed structurally impossible. Because the B-17 had been built with excess capacity, weight that engineers had tolerated in exchange for survivability. It was not sleek. It was not fast compared to fighters, but it could take punishment. Still, survival was not solely about metal. It was about discipline. Holding formation under flak. Maintaining heading during fighter attack. Not panicking when an engine failed. The B-17 survived what should have killed it, because it was designed to resist immediate collapse. But also because the men inside it refused to abandon it until no other option remained. And sometimes, astonishingly, that refusal carried them all the way home. The legend of the B-17 did not begin in combat. It began in a factory. Long before it absorbed flak over Schweinfurt or cannon fire over Bremen, the Flying Fortress was a product of deliberate engineering philosophy. Boeing's design team in the 1930s was tasked with creating a heavy bomber capable of long-range flight, significant bomb load, and defensive survivability. What they produced was not elegant in the aerodynamic sense, it was robust. The B-17 was built around a strong semi-monocoque fuselage, a structural design in which the skin and internal framework shared load-bearing responsibility. Beneath its thin aluminum exterior lay a lattice of frames, stringers, and longerons designed to distribute stress along the length of the aircraft. This mattered enormously in combat.